one whose clothes are clean but never new, the one who drives a truck so old that younger people in town cannot even identify the model year, the one who never eats at restaurants, never takes vacations, never shows up to anything with anything shiny or impressive, the one that people point to, quietly, behind his back, when they want an example of someone who never quite made it. That is old George, they would say. Poor old George. Worked his whole life and never had anything to show for it. They said it with pity, sometimes with a little superiority. The way comfortable people talk about someone they have decided is beneath their notice. And George heard it. Not always, but enough. He heard it and he said nothing. He just went home, to his small house, on his old street, and he sat in his chair by the window and he smiled, because George had a secret. And the secret was this: every single person in that town who pitied him, every person who pointed and whispered and felt quietly superior, every doctor and lawyer and businessman and high earner who drove past his small house and felt grateful they had done better than old George, not one of them, not a single one, was as financially free as he was, not even close. This is the story of George, the poorest-looking man in town, and the secret he carried that most people spend their entire lives searching for, without ever finding it. George was born in 1929, the year the world fell apart, the year the stock market collapsed, and banks closed, and families who had spent decades building something watched it disappear in a matter of weeks. George did not remember the crash itself. He was too young, but he grew up inside its aftermath, in a small farming town in rural Kentucky, where the depression did not lift quickly or cleanly, where it lingered for years like a cold that never fully left the lungs. His father was a farmer. His mother took in laundry and mending. They had very little, but they had something that George would spend the rest of his life recognizing as the most valuable thing his parents ever gave him. They had no debt, not a single dollar owed to anyone, in a town where neighbors had lost farms to banks, where families had been forced off land their grandfathers had cleared, where the word mortgage had become synonymous with loss and shame, and the particular devastation of working for something your whole life and watching it be taken. George's parents had nothing owing. Their house was small and simple. Their land was modest, but it was theirs, completely, unconditionally, permanently theirs. George's father said it to him once, when George was about 7 years old. They were sitting on the porch, watching a neighbor family load their belongings onto a wagon. The bank had foreclosed. They were leaving land that had been in their family for 3 generations. His father watched in silence for a long moment. Then he said, "You see that, son?" George nodded. "That is what owing looks like when it comes to collect." He said nothing else. He did not need to. George was 7 years old, and that image, that wagon, that family, that land they would never see again, was burned into him so deeply that 70 years later he could still describe exactly what the light looked like that afternoon. George grew up watching. That was his gift, his defining characteristic from childhood all the way through old age. He watched everything with a quiet intensity that most people mistook for slowness. He was not slow. He was processing. He watched which families in his town survived the depression with something intact and which ones were destroyed by it. And what he saw was not complicated. The families who survived were not necessarily the richest before the crash. They were not the most educated, not the most socially connected, not the ones with the biggest houses or the most impressive reputations. The families who survived were the ones who owed the least. Simple as that. No mortgage meant no foreclosure. No debt meant no collector could come and take what you had built. No obligation to anyone meant that when the world fell apart around you, you were still standing on ground that belonged to you. George filed this away, deeply, permanently. He also watched something else that most people in his town did not notice. He watched what happened to the families who recovered quickly after the depression ended. The ones who got back on their feet, got jobs, started earning again, and then, almost immediately, started spending again. New things, better things. Things on credit because credit was available again, and the memory of what credit had cost them was already fading. George watched them and thought, they learned nothing. The lesson was right there, and they walked straight past it. He was 12 years old when he thought this, and he never changed his mind. George left school at 16 to work, not because he had to, though the family could use the income, but because he had already decided what he was going to do with his life, and school was not going to teach him how to do it. He got a job at a hardware supply warehouse on the edge of the county. Physical work. Loading, unloading, inventory, deliveries. It paid modestly, not impressively. But George was not looking for impressive. He was looking for enough, because enough, combined with a particular relationship with that enough, was all he needed. From his very first paycheck, George did something that none of his co-workers did. He divided it, not randomly, not loosely, with absolute precision and intention. A fixed percentage went to his mother, his contribution to the household. A fixed percentage went into a jar, untouchable, savings. The remainder was his to live on, not the other way around, not save what is left after living. Live on what is left after saving. That sequence, save first, live on the rest, seems simple, almost obvious when you say it out loud, but almost nobody does it. Almost everyone does the opposite. Earn, spend, save whatever happens to remain, which is usually nothing. George flipped the order, and kept it flipped for the next 60 years, without exception, without interruption, without a single month where the sequence changed. His co-workers at the warehouse earned similar wages. Some earned more. Within 5 years, George had savings that none of them could match. Not because he earned more, because he kept more of what he earned. By the time George was in his late 20s, he had developed a reputation in town. Not the reputation he deserved, but the one that people assign to anyone who lives below their means, in a culture that equates spending with success. George is poor. George never has anything. George is one of those people who just never quite gets ahead. It started because of his truck. While other men his age were buying new vehicles, on installment, on credit, on the intoxicating feeling of driving something shiny off a lot, George drove the same truck year after year. It ran. It was maintained. It did exactly what a truck was supposed to do. But it was not new. And not new, in that town, in that era, read as not successful. Then there were his clothes, clean, pressed, appropriate for every occasion, but never fashionable, never upgraded beyond what was functional. His house. He bought it in his early 30s. Small, simple, priced well below what the bank told him he could afford. He paid it off in 11 years. 11 years instead of 30, because he paid extra every single month without fail. The day he made the final payment, George sat at his kitchen table for a long time. He did not celebrate in any way that anyone could see. He just sat there and felt something that he would spend the rest of his life describing to anyone who would listen. Freedom, he called it. Real freedom. The kind you can feel in your chest. Not the freedom to buy things. The freedom from owing anyone anything. He was 43 years old. His house was paid for. His truck was paid for. He owed nothing to anyone on earth. And in that small Kentucky town where everyone pitied poor old George, not a single one of his pitiers could say the same. The years after paying off his house were the years George called his building years, because now, for the first time, everything he saved had nowhere it needed to go. No mortgage payment, absorbing a portion of every paycheck. No debt, demanding its monthly share. Every dollar he set aside was purely, completely his. And George set aside a lot of dollars. He bought a small piece of land on the edge of town. Not for development, not for farming at scale. Just land. Something that would hold its value. Something that could not be inflated away or eroded by a bank's decision. He bought another piece a few years later, then a third. Small purchases, patient purchases, none of them dramatic, none of them the kind of thing that made people turn their heads. Just a man quietly buying pieces of ground with money he had saved by living on less than he earned. Year after year, decade after decade, he never told anyone about the land. Not because he was secretive by nature, but because he had learned early that people respond to visible wealth with visible opinions. And George did not want opinions. He wanted results. So he drove his old truck, wore his clean, functional clothes, lived in his small, paid-for house, and said nothing, while the town pitied him and the land quietly accumulated. I want to pause here for just a moment, because I want you to notice something about George. He was not doing anything complicated. He was not investing in exotic instruments or timing markets or leveraging sophisticated financial strategies. He was doing three things: spending less than he earned, eliminating debt as fast as possible, and buying things that held real value with the difference. Three things, consistently, for decades. That is the entire secret. And yet, most people never do it. If this story is making you think about your own life, subscribe to Ember and Echo right now. We share stories like George's every single week. Real people, real wisdom. The kind of lessons that change how you see money forever. Subscribe. It is free. And it might be the most important thing you do today. Now, let us get back to George, because the secret is about to be revealed. George was 71 years old when his secret came out, not by his choice, by circumstances. His wife Margaret, a quiet woman who had shared his philosophy completely and without complaint for 40 years, passed away in the spring. George sat with his grief privately, the way he did everything. But his children, 2 sons and a daughter, came home for the funeral. And in the process of settling certain paperwork that Margaret's passing required, they sat down with their father at the kitchen table, with everything laid out. For the first time, his oldest son, a man in his late 40s who had spent his career in sales and had always quietly pitied his father's modest life, sat across the table and stared at the documents. For a long time he said nothing. Then he said, "Dad." Just that. George looked at him. "Dad, how?" Because what was on that table was not what any of them had expected. 3 paid pieces of land. The house, paid off for nearly 30 years. A savings account that had grown with quiet consistency for over 5 decades. No debt, not a dollar, no mortgage, no car payment, no credit card balance. No loan of any kind to any person or institution, just assets, clean, unencumbered, completely owned. The total, when his son calculated it, was more than anyone in that room had imagined, more than the neighbors with their bigger houses, more than the colleagues with their impressive careers, more than the people who had driven past George's small house for 40 years and felt quietly grateful they had done better. His daughter sat back in her chair. "People in this town think you never had anything," she said quietly. George nodded. "I know," he said. "Did that bother you?" she asked. He thought about it for a moment. "Not once," he said. That evening, after the paperwork was done, his oldest son sat with George on the porch, the same porch where George had watched his neighbor load a wagon as a 7-year-old boy. The son wanted to understand, not just the numbers, the thinking. "How did you do it, Dad? Really? What was the secret?" George was quiet for a while. He looked out at the street, at the neighbors' houses, bigger than his, with newer vehicles in the driveways, with the visible marks of people who spent their money on things that could be seen. Then he said, "There is no secret. That is the secret." His son looked at him. "Everyone is looking for something complicated," George said. "Some trick, some system, some investment that nobody else knows about." He shook his head slowly. "The whole thing is simpler than anyone wants to hear. You earn money. You keep some of it, before you spend any of it. You get rid of anything you owe as fast as you possibly can. And you never, not once, spend money trying to look like you have more than you do." He paused. "That is it. That is all of it." His son sat there. "But people think you are poor," he said. George smiled, the first real smile his son had seen from him since Margaret passed. "Poor," he said slowly. "I own every inch of ground I stand on. I owe nothing to any man or any bank. I wake up every morning, and the first thought in my head is not about a payment that is due." He looked at his son. "Which one of the people in this town who pity me can say that?" His son had no answer. George's secret was not complicated, but it was rare, because living it requires something that our entire culture works against every single day. It requires the willingness to look like less than you are, to drive the old truck while everyone else drives new ones, to live in the small house while everyone else mortgages the bigger one, to wear the functional clothes while everyone else upgrades to the fashionable ones, to absorb the pity and the whispers and the quiet superiority of people who are measuring your worth by things that have no relationship to your actual financial reality. That is hard. It is psychologically hard in a way that no financial textbook fully captures, because human beings are social creatures. We care what others think. We want to be seen as successful. We want the visible markers that tell the world, and ourselves, that we have made it. George understood this. He was not immune to it, but he had something that most people do not develop until it is too late. A very clear memory of a 7-year-old boy watching a neighbor family load a wagon, and a very clear understanding of what owing looks like when it comes to collect. So here is what George's secret actually was, stated plainly. 1. Spend less than you earn. Always. Without exception. This is not a suggestion. It is the foundation of everything. 2. Save first. Before you spend $1 on anything else, set aside your savings. Treat it like a bill, the most important bill, the one that cannot be skipped. 3. Eliminate debt aggressively. Every dollar you owe is a claim on your future. Pay it off faster than required. Always. 4. Buy things that hold value. Land, property, assets that do not depreciate. Things that will be worth something tomorrow, regardless of what the economy decides to do. 5. Never spend money on appearance. The truck, the clothes, the restaurant. These things communicate nothing true about your financial reality. They only drain resources that could be building something real. That is the whole secret. 5 things. None of them complicated. All of them requiring the one thing that is genuinely rare in this world. The discipline to do them consistently, even when nobody is watching, even when people are pitying you, even when the culture around you is screaming the opposite in every advertisement and social media post and conversation at every dinner table. George did them for 60 years and died the freest man in a town full of people who spent their whole lives thinking they were doing better than him. I think about George when I feel the pull, and we all feel the pull toward the new thing, the better thing, the thing that signals to the world that we have arrived. I think about that small house on that old street, that ancient truck that ran perfectly and communicated nothing impressive to anyone, those clean, functional clothes that nobody complimented and nobody needed to. And I think about a man sitting on his porch at 71, owning every inch of ground he could see, owing nothing to anyone on earth, watching his neighbors' bigger houses with their newer trucks and their visible marks of people who spent their money on things that could be seen, and smiling, not with superiority, with a peace that those neighbors, for all their apparent success, could not access, because peace of that kind is not purchased. It is built, slowly, quietly, over decades of choosing reality over appearance, function over fashion, freedom over the feeling of looking free. The poorest man in town, with the most valuable secret, and the last laugh that nobody ever heard coming. Whatever your version of the old truck is, keep driving it. Whatever your version of the small house is, pay it off faster. Whatever the town thinks of you while you do it, let them think it. Because George's secret was never really a secret at all. It was